Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I am with the Adult Services Department at Shaker Heights Public Library. You are watching Sourdough Basics Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1 yet, please definitely check that out first. That will help you to get started with making your own sourdough culture. And then in this Part 2, we are going to go ahead and use that culture to bake our first loaf of sourdough bread. Before we get into our recipe today, I do want to take a moment to talk about how to measure your ingredients because this is important and this will impact the quality of the loaf of bread that you get to make. When you bake, there are measurements that you can take typically either by volume or by weight. If you're measuring by volume, you are actually measuring how much space something fills. Examples of that would be cups or liters, so a cup of flour or a cup of butter. If you're measuring by weight, then you are measuring the heaviness or the mass of something, and that's typically measured in grams or ounces. And I have an illustration at the bottom of the page here to kind of make this idea a little bit easier to understand because volume and weight are very different. In the picture, we have a scale, and on the right side of the scale, we have a stack of bricks. On the left side of the scale, there's a stack of straw. Both the straw and the bricks have the exact same weight. But because straw is very light and fluffy and bricks are very dense, it takes a much larger volume of straw to equal the same weight of the bricks. If we transfer that idea over to baking, you can see differences in using different types of flour. They'll have different weight measurements depending on what type of flour they are. So, for example, a whole wheat flour is not very light and fluffy, whereas a cake flour is very light and fluffy. So, the cake flour would be a bit like that stack of straw. So if you filled up 1 cup of cake flour and 1 cup of whole wheat flour, they would have very different weights. It would actually require more cake flour to achieve the exact same weight in your whole wheat flour. So, in order to take the guesswork out of your recipes and help you to maintain a very consistent quality in your baking, it's highly recommended that when you handle your ingredients that you measure them out using weight. Here are a couple of examples of food scales that you can use to measure your ingredients. On the left, you'll find a digital scale, and on the right is a more old fashioned analog scale. Either one of these scales would be perfect to use for measuring ingredients. You just want to make sure that whatever scale you choose to use, it measures in either grams or ounces. Here is a recipe for an easy artisan sourdough bread. This is one that I used to make my very first sourdough loaf. And the ingredients are very simple. We've already talked a bit about the importance of using weight as your measurement. So I'll go ahead and get started going through those ingredients. We want 500 grams or 17.65 ounces of unbleached flour, 250 grams, which is the equivalent of 8.8 ounces of warm water, 150 grams or 5.35 ounces of sourdough starter, 10 grams or zero point 0.4 ounces of salt, 25 grams or zero point 0.9 ounces of oil, and a Dutch oven for baking. A couple of notes about those ingredients. The oil is an optional ingredient. If you want to add it, you can. You don't have to. I find that when I add it, it does improve the texture of the crumb. It almost gets a little bit more velvety, which I kind of like. With the sourdough starter, you want to make sure that the last time that you fed that was the night before you want to use it. And basically, what you're doing is you're feeding it in the evening, That way, when you wake up in the morning and you're ready to make the dough, the yeast are nice and hungry again and they're ready to get to work breaking down the starches in the flour. Okay, so we're ready to get started. All of your ingredients are measured out by weight. Now you can whisk together your starter, water, and oil in a large bowl. Go ahead and add in the flour and the salt. And from there, mix everything together by hand. It's going to be kind of rough looking. It's going to be a little scraggly looking. That's okay. It doesn't have to be pretty quite yet. I have a picture of what my dough looked like just off to the right. Once you have everything all mixed together, go ahead and let that dough rest for 30 to 60 minutes. Right, so we have let that dough rest for 30 to 60 minutes. Now it's going to be time to let it rise. You want to cover up your dough with some plastic wrap or a damp kitchen towel. Place it in a warm spot. This rise could take anywhere from 3 to 12 hours. You essentially want it to double in size. If you have a very warm kitchen, say it's 85 degrees in there, your rise may only take 3 to 4 hours. You could have a cooler kitchen and it may take 10 to 12 hours. Now, during this rise, you will need to turn and stretch this dough 2 separate times. And you want to do this maybe an hour in between those turning and stretching cycles. So, I've got some pictures down here at the bottom to kind of show you what I mean when I say turning and stretching. If you start at the left picture, far left, that is the round dough. And I have in my mind imagined this dough to have a top, a bottom, and a left and a right. If I gently pinch the top of that dough, I'm going to stretch it, not tearing, just gently stretching, and then fold that top back to the center. Then I'm going to turn my bowl to the right. And again, I'm going to take the top of that dough, gently stretch it, and fold it back to the center. So the picture that's on the far right, I have taken the top 2 times and folded it towards the center. But you can see I also have to do that about 2 more times to get all 4 sides of that dough folded to the center. That is one cycle of stretching and turning this dough. You want to do that 2 times during the rise, and you want them to be at least an hour apart in between those turning and stretching sessions. Now, when you're doing that, that allows the gluten a chance to develop. It gets a little bit stronger and helps the bread to rise. Once your dough has doubled, you're going to want to make some space on the counter. You want to divide that space into 2 areas, one where you can sprinkle out some flour and the other where it's left clean. So you're going to turn your dough out initially onto the side of the counter that's floured. If you choose, you can actually divide your dough right now into two. That way you can make 2 small loaves, or you can keep this dough all together and make a bigger loaf of bread. Up to you. So now you've turned your dough out. The bottom of the dough has a little bit of flour on it. You're going to pick it up and then place it on the clean side of your counter where there is no flour sprinkled. You're going to fold this dough using that turning and stretching technique, just like you did during the rise period. You want to do that one more time right now. When that's done, flip the dough over so that the seam from all of that turning and stretching is on the bottom, touching your counter. And then using your hands, you're going to kind of cup that dough ball between your hands and you're going to gently twist it and rotate it a couple of times so that you allow it to kind of get a nice, pretty, smooth, round shape. And as you turn this, you'll probably notice that you get a little bit of tension across the top of the dough, and that's good. You actually want that. If you have turned your dough, but it still feels pretty loose across the top. If you see a lot of wrinkles across the top of that dough, then as you turn it, you can gently pull it a little bit towards you on that unfloured counter surface, and that will help to not only round it, but tighten it across the top of that dough ball. Okay, so keeping your dough nice and taut and round, you're going to gently lift it up and place it on a piece of parchment paper. You can then lift the dough using the corners of the parchment like a sling and place that dough somewhere warm for one more rise cycle. And that rise is going to take about an hour. It's not going to double in size like it did before. Instead, during that hour, it's going to get a little bit taller and a little bit puffier, nowhere near double. For me, I like to place this dough for the final rise into a container that's kind of like a serving bowl or a mixing bowl. And I do that so that it retains its nice shape. We talked a little bit earlier about how sourdough likes to spread. So if you just leave it flat on the counter as it rises, it may try to spread out the sides instead of rising up. If you put it in a container of some kind, then it will tend to rise up instead of out. Now, 30 minutes into that final rise, you're going to preheat your oven to 450 degrees and place your Dutch oven inside so that it gets nice and hot. Be aware that if you have a Dutch oven where the handle for the lid is made out of plastic or resin, it may not be able to withstand those really high temperatures in the oven. So you may want to consider removing that handle, unscrewing it, and then just kind of very gently using a pot holder to lift your lid on and off. If you have a metal lid for your Dutch oven, then you're going to be just fine. Okay, so you made it through the final rise of your dough. Now we are getting ready to put this into the oven. So before you do that, you want to make a slash across the top of the dough, and this allows for the dough to rise even higher as it bakes in the oven, and it also allows for steam to escape from the dough. And within that Dutch oven, the steam helps to develop this really crispy, delicious crust on the outside. So you want to carefully remove your hot Dutch oven. Use your pot holders. It's going to be super, super hot. Lift your dough using the parchment paper corners and then place that dough into the pot. The parchment is going to stay under your dough. Go ahead, put your lid back on the Dutch oven and place it inside your baking oven. Lower the temperature to 400 degrees and then bake it for 20 to 30 minutes. After that 20 to 30 minutes, you're going to remove the lid and let it bake an additional 20 to 30 minutes until the crust is this beautiful deep golden brown color. Let it cool completely before slicing. Now, in the photos I have down here at the bottom, the one that's all the way to the left is the design that I cut into the top of my loaf before I baked it. I wanted to have a design that was going to allow it to open up and rise to the fullest extent possible. The picture in the middle is what the loaf looked like right after I took off the lid for the Dutch oven. So it had only baked for about 20 to 30 minutes. You can see that it has risen up. It looks really pretty and gorgeous, but it's pale. So it's obviously not done, but that crust has started to develop. And then the picture all the way to the right is the finished loaf. Nice and golden brown, looks crispy, delicious, wonderful, smells even better. So the picture that you see on the far left is the finished loaf. Looked really beautiful, stayed nice and round, rose up nice and tall, really expanded up into the top where I made those cuts on the top of the loaf. The middle picture, you, I hope, can see it's a pretty moist on the inside and yet maintained that nice crispy crust around the outside edges. And then the gratuitous close up of a slice that I had a chance to enjoy. You can see the crusty bits around the edges, some butter, and some really delicious bagel seasoning that I had sprinkled on top. It was really excellent. Your sourdough culture is alive and it's a little bit like having a pet. Feel free to name it, definitely feed it, maybe give it a little bit of love. If you want to be able to use this culture on a regular basis, then continue to discard half of it and then feed it daily. If you only want to use it occasionally, then feed it and place it into the refrigerator for up to a week. After a week, you will need to pull it back out, discard half, and feed again. If you want to use it to bake, then basically feed it and let it sit on your countertop overnight to warm it up. If you only want to use this culture once in a great while, then you can spread your culture out nice and thin on a piece of parchment paper. Let that dry, and then flake the dried culture and pack it into a Ziploc style bag. Those flakes can be placed in your freezer for long term storage. If you want to use them at that point, you'll pull those flakes out, add a little bit of water to reconstitute them, and then give it a couple of feedings to kind of recover from that long-term storage. The one thing that I didn't like about maintaining my sourdough culture was that I had to discard part of it every day while I was keeping it fed and ready to bake with. Um, I wanted to try and find some ways to efficiently use that discard rather than just tossing it out. And there are some really creative recipes out there. I've got pictures of a couple of things that I have made using that discarded material from my culture. The picture that's on the upper right is a cinnamon streusel cake. The recipe for that I found on kingarthurflour.com. I've got the web address there towards the bottom of the page. The other picture is a chocolate sourdough cake that I made and then put a cream cheese icing on. It was really great. In both of these recipes, they had a flavor that was a little bit something. You knew there was something just a little bit different, maybe just a little bit of tang in the flavor. But really, if you didn't tell someone that there was sourdough in it, you really wouldn't guess that that's an ingredient that went into that recipe. So you can absolutely find these really creative ways to use that discard. Some other ideas would be pancakes and waffles, sourdough pretzels, crackers, flatbreads. You can make pie crust. You can do brownies and cookies. The internet is absolutely full of recipes that people have found as ways to use up that discard material instead of throwing it out. A couple of places that I can recommend for you to try would be kingarthurflour.com or allrecipes.com. And for either one of those sites, there's going to be a search bar at the top. If you just type in sourdough, you will receive a whole bunch of results, and hopefully something there looks good to you. There are a couple of books that I would like to recommend for those of you interested in reading more about sourdough baking. There's Tartine by Chad Robertson, available on Overdrive and Libby. From No Need to Sourdough by Victoria Redhead Miller, available on Hoopla, and New World Sourdough, available on Hoopla, Overdrive, and Libby. If you find that you need some additional assistance, maybe you have some questions about the way that your sourdough culture looks, there are some resources available out on the internet that you might want to take a look at. The Perfect Loaf, which is available on theperfectloaf.com. Once you go to the site, click on guides at the top of the page. Not only do they have a guide on how to grow your sourdough culture, but they have a guide on how to use that culture in your baking. There's also Food 52, which is a food blog site. They are located at food52.com. There's a search bar at the top of that page. If you just search sourdough, you'll get a whole bunch of recipes for using your sourdough culture and even some tips and tricks that you'll find mixed in there as well. And then my favorite would be the King Arthur Flour site. You can access that at kingarthurbaking.com. Towards the top of the page, if you click the button that says Learn, it will take you into a section that's full of baking guides for all different kinds of baking styles, including sourdough. And I'd like to leave you with a little food for thought. Sourdough cultures and coronavirus actually have a little something in common. They both need a hospitable environment in which to thrive. Just as you can feed and nurture your sourdough, you can also help to make the world a more unfriendly place for coronavirus. Remember to practice social distancing and frequent hand washing. If you can, please wear a mask.